night began the way old stories often do, slowly, gently, as if the universe itself were listening to its own breath. In a small New England town in 1890, the golden light melted into the fog like liquid honey, threading softly along the wooden boards of the main street. The shadows of maple trees swayed in the wind, as though they remembered footsteps from a long-forgotten dance. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, mingling with the sweetness of apple cider. Overhead, a copper moon hung low, snagging on the church steeple before climbing leisurely into the night sky. Children in borrowed coats and hastily made masks ran about in small groups, some draped in burlap, some with faces chalk white, others wearing paper antlers cut from an old catalogue. Meanwhile, mothers set warm pies on windowsills, letting the autumn breeze carry their fragrance down the street. Fathers gathered under the dim light outside the general store, exchanging familiar nods as the old sign creaked in the wind, advertising horse oil, seed packets, or the latest phonograph. From afar, the faint whistle of a train stitched the town to the rolling hills beyond. A dog howled, then fell silent, as if realizing this was not the night to disturb the stillness. They called it Halloween, though in older tongues it had gone by other names. Samhain, the end of summer, the moment when the veil between this world and the next hung thin. In this town, where the minister cherished solemnity, no one spoke of such things aloud, but they acknowledged the fragile boundary in quiet ways. Lanterns burned longer, bread was sliced an extra piece for the departed. Carved turnips with human faces stood on doorsteps, small silent sentinels keeping watch. That old habit had changed with time, blending into the soil, but it still carried the hush of the past, like a winter river remembering where it once curved around an ancient oak. On the porches, pumpkins glowed with carefully carved smiles, fruits of the new world bearing the faces of the old. The children didn't think much of it. They only knew that when a candle burned inside a pumpkin, its light looked like a gentle heart beating. And when that heart was placed by the door, the darkness seemed less frightening. It bowed and smiled back. On the grass, someone prepared a tub for apple bobbing. Laughter and shrieks rose in bursts through the mist. Faces flushed, hands dripping wet, but eyes gleamed with joy. Chestnuts cracked open by the fire, and older girls whispered silly rhymes about love through shy giggles. Behind the schoolhouse, a few boys plotted mischief, not cruel, just playful pranks. The morning paper would cluck its tongue about. A gate lifted and dragged a few feet away, a farmer's wagon wheel hidden among barrels, or a cellar door tied to ring with the wind. Every prank carried its own moral of mischief. After the hard harvest, even work-worn hearts needed a little wild laughter to loosen their rhythm. In a warm kitchen, the minister's wife, gentler than her husband, set down a fresh loaf of bread, drawing a cross in butter across its crust. She told her youngest child, "It's good to remember those who've gone before us. Memory, my dear, is the bridge, the living cross every day without knowing." No one in that house called it All Saints' Eve, but the candles she lit burned patiently, their light brushing against framed photos on the shelf, lingering there as if wishing to speak. Outside, the schoolmaster, the most learned man in town, told the blacksmith that the Celts once saw Samhain as the beginning of winter, the moment when the boundary between worlds softened. The blacksmith, who trusted his hands more than history, simply nodded. "Same every year," he said. "When the first frost kisses my anvil, my heart softens too." Nearby, a 16-year-old farm girl with a blue ribbon around her neck stood by the fence, watching lanterns shimmer. Her aunt had once told her old country tales in a slow voice, that people would disguise themselves and go door to door reciting verses for cakes, that masks fooled wandering spirits so they wouldn't recognize the living. Around the crackling bonfire, each person stepped through the smoke with a secret wish. The girl didn't remember the words, only that tonight something ancient seemed to breathe with the earth, not fierce, but listening, like the pause before a lullaby begins. She pressed her hands together and thought that if she stayed quiet long enough, the wind might whisper a sentence meant only for her to carry through the winter. Not far away, a young printer, his fingers still stained with ink, leaned in a doorway thinking about tomorrow's headlines: Halloween pranks spread but harmless, or Youth and the Old Festival. He liked the phrase Old Festival. It sounded warm and true. He had seen widows smile faintly as masked children passed by, and old men straighten their backs when an apple surfaced in the bobbing tub. Something about this night softened sorrow, and he knew, though no one said it, that tonight the town was learning how to be gentle beneath its playful disguise. Across the street, two boys with lanterns dared each other to read names on gravestones without trembling. They didn't get far. Hearing a rustle in the grass, they hurried back, whispering, "Just a rabbit, probably." Standing at the edge of the crowd, they held their masks in silence, quieter than usual. The night drifted on. The moon climbed higher, the wind shifted, and somewhere a fiddle began to play, a tune half music, half prayer. Here there was no clear line between the sacred and the simple, only a humble belief that the old year had ended and people ought to see it off with warmth. Perhaps years later, scholars would debate the origins, Gaelic or Christian, ritual or jest. But in 1890 no one cared. The town simply closed the day the way a mother tucks in her sleeping child, fastening the door with a gentle click. Lanterns dimmed, cider cups emptied. The faraway whistle of a train broke, then faded into quiet. And in a small attic, a turnip carved by an old woman's trembling hands, because she still preferred turnips to pumpkins, stood guard by the window until its flame sank into ash. Down on the street, a tradition that had crossed oceans and centuries exhaled softly again, and in that tender darkness, a question rose. How do such small gestures weave together to create a night like this? And who, or what, first taught time itself to turn at the threshold between autumn and winter? The next morning would carry a faint scent of ash and apples, while the second hour of the evening opened like a page carefully smoothed flat. What had earlier been lively notes of merriment now settled, sinking into a kind of quiet attentiveness, almost ritual in its natural grace. The girl with the ribbon at her neck lingered by the communal well, and the older woman, her grandmother, whose fingers were soft as a thimble's touch, said that nights like this were not made in a single breath, but stitched from many small threads. A door answered here, a rhyme remembered there, a borrowed mask, a candle passed from one hearth to another. And if anyone asked where it all began, she would tilt her head and say, beginnings were like the season's first snow on the field. You see it as one silent blanket, but it falls flake by flake, each bearing its own shy story. So the girl listened. The town breathed slowly, and the church bell, cautious all day, remained silent, as though unwilling to startle the fragile place in the air. Along the narrow road, a boy with printer's ink under his fingernails held a paper cone of roasted chestnuts, thinking how the disguises his grandfather had told him about seemed not so different from what he and his friends did, only gentler, less severe. He wondered if the rhyme his friend had recited on a doorstep, a soul, a soul, a soul cake, please, had crossed the salt of the sea, changed its shoes at the docks, traded solemnity for laughter. Not far away, the blacksmith hung his lantern on a nail by the door, leaned back in his chair, and, without naming it, felt the sweet ache of time folding in, the season's first chill making even the iron rings shine a little brighter. He thought of the bonfires his mother had told him of, where people leapt for luck, and though tonight no great fire burned, only a neat hearth and a few pumpkins smiling quietly, he felt as if the old flames had come indoors, hidden in lamplight and laughter. On the schoolhouse window, the notice for Friday's spelling test clung to the glass as if listening too. Inside, the teacher had left his book open to the chapter on folk customs, and anyone glancing over his shoulder would have seen a line about thresholds, that life was full of hope at the threshold, that a door invited wishes, whispered promises. Tonight, he thought, was the threshold of the year, the hour when harvest looked back. Winter leaned forward, and the living saw the names of the departed appear like breath on a window pane. At the town's edge, 2 labourers followed a fence, softly recalling the year's losses and gains. One, usually quiet, admitted that he always left a small piece of bread on the hearth on nights like this, not out of superstition, but out of courtesy to anyone who might be passing by. His laughing companion nodded gravely, saying that was enough. The pastor's wife passed along, drawing her shawl close, then stopped at a sound, a violin testing a phrase, touching a minor key before easing away. She stood still, letting the melody slip into her shawl like a friendly cat. In her quiet heart, she realized that grace could wear many garments. Sometimes a sermon, sometimes a lullaby, sometimes the quicksilver gleam of a young foot on a porch step. And then the night leaned slightly, revealing a small sign not to be mistaken. A gentle breath of wind brushed past like a hand on the shoulder, cool and damp in the leaves, a thread of silver along the fence, as though the moon had lent ordinary things a second, secret outline. Within that outline, the ribboned girl did not think she saw ghosts, but memory itself walking politely, old neighbours, an aunt long gone, nameless hands that once planted lilacs, mended quilts, taught recipes that were really stories of patience. She was not afraid, only accompanied, like a traveller who finds a lantern newly lit on a distant porch as the road darkens. Near the green, a few boys who had dared the cemetery earlier now rolled their hoops with softer noise. They had learned, without being told, that too much commotion could blur the delicate border of this hour. They whispered about the carved face's origins. One swore his uncle said the light was meant to chase off a miserly spirit fond of tricking travellers. Another claimed the glow did not drive away but guided the lost. Their debate required no victory. Both were right, like 2 colours on the same leaf. Overhead, the evening train drew a thin line of sound across the air. Whoever heard it thought of other towns, other porches, other pumpkin faces, and a kindred hush fell at once, the feeling that this belonged not only to them, but to a longer river of night, still flowing long after tomorrow's modest headlines dried. In some far future, someone might call this trick-or-treat, wrap candies in paper, write to editors wondering if it had lost its way or not. But here, in 1890, it was still a carefully sewn pouch, where gentleness borrowed a mischievous mask so it could walk the streets unashamed. And if while listening, you feel that same tender current spill through your own window, if the light pools on your floor like warm honey, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. The world is vast. yet our small lights still find each other. If this drifting quiet pleases you, if stories like these let your breath soften, then rest closer to the entire history. Subscribe so we may meet again in the next gentle hour. For the night still has much to give. There are names carved on black stone at the cemetery wall, apple seeds deciding futures at the bottom of plates, and a door somewhere along some road about to open to an unexpected face, and the ribboned girl, listening as though to a seashell, will carry home a single phrase, like an ember cupped between her hands, while across the last garden something quiet and kind waits, as if an invisible threshold were stirring awake within the frost. When the hour hand touched 9, the town's pulse softened into a gentle quiet, and the small rituals began like neatly folded slips of paper, odd little customs that had crossed hearths and oceans, each carrying its own careful breath. In the parlour of the house with green shutters, a few older girls tried the apple peel charm. The peel spun into a thin ribbon until it fell in a loop upon the braided rug. They leaned close to see if its shape resembled the first letter of any name. And Awan, her cheeks flushed pink from laughter tinged with fear, swore she saw a character belonging to no boy she knew. Next door, 2 sisters brought out a plate, a thimble, and a ring from the cupboard, blindfolding each other, reaching timidly to see which object they would touch first. Work, travel, or marriage, while their mother, who had played this tender nonsense herself at 16, lifted the kettle lid so the steam could whisper. Farther down the narrow road, a silent supper was laid, with an extra place for the invisible guest at the end of the table, and the entire meal passed without a word. The hush was so complete that when the butter knife paused, one could almost hear time itself shifting like a breath within the room. No one declared belief or disbelief. The hard edges of such words felt too sharp for a night like this, but everyone sensed meaning hovering close, ready to alight if treated kindly. The printer's devil, thin, quick, handed out his last flyers for Saturday's auction, pausing at each doorstep to glimpse the private universe of every home, a fortune cake dusted with soot to decide tomorrow, a mirror turned to the wall so no reflection would speak tonight, and pumpkins glowing softly, steadily, as if breathing with the room. He wondered whether the newspaper ought to write about such things, or if the finest truths were meant to remain in the form of warmth, never cooled into words. In the yard, frost touched the grass like lace upon the pastor's wife's sleeve. She had just come up from the cellar with last summer's jar of peaches, setting it on the table, as if to say sweetness can endure any winter. When her husband returned from visiting the fields, brim damp with chill, he spoke gently of the thin border between superstition and memory. She listened in the way a wife does, who knows that names matter less than tenderness. She poured him a cup of cider, placed a small plate by the window out of courtesy, and no sermon could ever convince her that such courtesy was wrong. At the livery stable, the blacksmith and a hired man tightened the strap, their talk falling in rhythm with the hammer between what is and what might be. Would the weather hold when the river's edges began to freeze? Would a man leading a stallion through the long dark months become lonelier or kinder? Then the blacksmith, almost shyly, told a story of his mother in County Antrim, how the boys would hollow pale turnips, tie strings, and set them on poles to keep a miserly fellow from troubling travellers. He'd forgotten the name, only remembered the soft laughter in his mother's voice, rocking chair creaking beneath it. Both men glanced toward the line of pumpkins in the alley, smiles thin as breath frost, and neither said aloud that the old tale had found a new orange face in this broad land, for pumpkins were simply the fertile gift of the soil. At the schoolhouse, the teacher returned to his book, tracing the passage about Samhain the first winter of the Gaelic world, the line that held him read, "The threshold is not merely a door, but the moment when a community practices kindness by pretending to be someone else for one sanctioned night." He closed the book as if fearing to pin the thought too tightly, then stepped outside to the sound of the violin shifting from minor to major, its melody descending like a narrow road and rising again as a warm streak of light. He thought, in years to come, scholars would debate the tangled bonds between people and memory, how an ancient festival had woven itself into a new world, about church feasts and surviving folklore, about how a ritual once old stitched itself anew, and whether newspapers and candy had changed its fabric beyond recognition. But tonight all arguments slept, and only the practice kept watch. In the ribboned girl's house, her grandmother wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and told the last story before the knocks ceased, a tale of a door mistakenly opened on such a night, a visitor smelling of rain, who warmed himself by the hearth and left only a dry leaf on the chair. No warning, only the kind of care one gives to twilight. The girl kept her own whisper, her wind-borne words from earlier, folded inside like a live coal. She did not yet know it would lead her to the cemetery gate before midnight, nor that something gentle was waiting there. By then, along the eaves, masks were turned upward, small hands sticky with apples, and even the mischievous ones grew quiet, as if the night itself required a softer step upon its back. The thin sound of a passing train stitched the town to places it would never see, making all who heard it a little less alone. A name on a gravestone waiting to be traced by a gloved finger, a half-finished joke turning kindly, and a pale ribbon of frost along the fence, like a path drawn by the moon, leading the ribboned girl, the printer's boy, and the blacksmith of few words toward the same gentle corner of night where a single candle stood guard in silence. Near 10 o'clock, the night sealed itself like an envelope already closed, and the town moved within a deliberate quiet, as though every porch and street had agreed to breathe a little softer. The girl with the ribbon wrapped a thin shawl around her shoulders, received her grandmother's blessing, no words, just a light touch to the forehead, and stepped into the pale silver frost edging the fence, where each blade of grass shimmered with a thread of moonlight. At first, she went only as far as the familiar green, where a few lanterns still stood guard. Their carved faces had softened into kindly squints, and the violin at the distant inn window had shed its haste, settling into the calm of someone who had just remembered the verse he meant to sing. At the livery, the blacksmith poured water onto the forge. The fire's red eye closed without complaint, and he stood with his apprentice at the doorway listening to the cooling metal's gentle chime, a quiet clock measuring a time apart from the rolls of paper at the town hall. Along the next street, two boys who'd plotted mischief all afternoon suddenly could not bring themselves to drag the cooper's rain barrel into the schoolyard, not from fear of scolding, but because the moonlight across the wooden slats had given the thing a dignity too fine to mock. So they set it back in place, tied to its handle a scrap of calico left from the summer fair, laughing at their own softness, yet warmed by it. The printer's boy, with letters still dusting his pockets, moved from window to window, memorizing the small bedtime rituals of each home, a plate resting against fogged glass, a mirror veiled in thin cloth, as if reflections too deserved rest, 3 apple seeds lined on a saucer like commas awaiting completions. A headline flickered in his mind, one that could never be printed, something like "Town practices a tenderness no one needed to permit." And he smiled quietly at the thought that the night itself could be set in type. Then he brushed it aside, straightened a notice, curling loose from the damp, as though the woman who would read about Saturday's auction deserved a neat welcome come morning. Near the parsonage, the pastor's wife took 2 preserved peaches from last year's jar, set them on a small dish by the sill, summer sunlight kept in syrup, and lingered a moment longer before blowing out the lamp, as if waiting for an old friend who might just be crossing the green. When the flame died, the room took on the soft geometry of moonlit rectangles. Within that chalky glow, she felt close to the names once whispered over cradles and graves, and seemed always to have known, without needing her husband's reasoning, that these customs were not bargains with darkness, but courtesies extended to memory. The schoolteacher, coat over arm, stepped into the night with a few lines forming in his mind to satisfy himself by morning, about thresholds and rehearsals, about the gentlest kind of masquerade, where an entire village relearns how to greet a stranger. He ran his hand along the fence rail, felt its silver chill, a faint sketch of winter, and smiled at the thought that the old folk had wisely chosen this hinge of the year, not the shouts of midsummer, but here, where harvest breath still lingered, and the first frost softened all that was familiar. Then, as if answering a decision just forming within her chest, the ribboned girl turned down the path toward the cemetery. She had made no promise to go so far. It was simply that the words she had whispered to the wind earlier now glowed like a coal, keeping its warmth, carrying her to the simple iron gate, where names on slate leaned back as though studying the stars. It was not courage that brought her there, only a sense of participation, as if bringing a neighbour a cup of water. She paused at the gate, laid a gloved hand on the bar. The metal returned a fine, familiar chill. The grass whispered to the small lives come and gone. The violin's distant song had folded itself into a single bow's touch. In that silence she spoke, softly, not boldly, just one phrase, shaped like gratitude, offered to the hands that once built fences, mended quilts, taught the baking of good bread, to the quiet craft by which a town held together through those never named on paper. Nothing stirred in reply, unless one counted the tilt of a drifting cloud, or the way dew on the path brightened as though the moon had stooped lower. She did not seek a sign. She stood still until our standing felt like a word fulfilled, then reached to the nearest stone, tracing each carved letter with the slow fidelity of one who reads to honour every stroke. Then, behind her, a step halted. The printer's boy said, "Good evening," as if nothing were strange, and did not ask why she was there. He offered a paper lantern, not yet lit, a small square frame, wrapped in oiled paper, and she smiled, taking the match he held out. The wick caught at once, opening into a flower of light. Its gentleness joined the moon's work without competing. Together they hung the lantern on the gate, as one might hang a wreath. For an instant the iron letters glowed warm, and the breeze, mild as breath, paused upon the grass. Back on the street, the world was unchanged, yet clearer, as though every house had settled more perfectly into its foundation. The blacksmith, seeing the little procession of light, 2 young figures, and one glowing square moving like a travelling window, tipped his hat. His apprentice, just leaving the forge with a pocket of horseshoe nails for the winter nights, handed 3 to a passing child for luck. On another porch, 2 boys spared the overturned barrel, chalking instead an apology for last year's broken chair, an awkward beginning that ended kindly, the tail of the word curling into a heart before anyone could scold them. Soon the lights would go out, yet much would still unfold before midnight. The pastor, returning late, would notice the glow at the gate and think of a hymn that tasted faintly of apples. The teacher would add a small margin note to his page, and the ribboned girl would walk home slowly, feeling as though The street itself were an old lullaby she had always known, while along the fence the moon kept its tender watch, and frost drew a pale necklace down the rail toward a door not yet open, but about to be. By 10:30, the town looked like a book whose spine had loosened, soft along the back, ready to turn its own pages. Human breath had become a series of small prayers before lips, and the frost along the railings glimmered into a fine underline, as if some careful hand were making gentle annotations upon the night. The ribboned girl and the printer's boy left the cemetery gate, the square of lantern light still lingering behind their eyes, and they noticed that the street had changed, not in shape, but in tenderness. The chalk-written apology now had two shy addenda, a crooked flower and a small earnest line reading, "We mean it," and the cooper, who might have scolded, merely brushed his sleeve across the board, softening the edges of chalk into something that resembled forgiveness. The blacksmith, fastening his latch, paused to hear the faint crackle of cooling iron and murmured to no one in particular, "It knows how to rest," as if metal were a creature aware of its own seasons. At the parsonage window the pastor's wife sat with her shawl drawn close, no lamp, no fire, letting the moon cast a silver square upon her lap, while the two preserved peaches slept quietly on the plate, remembering June on her behalf. On the green, the violin bowed its head to silence, yet a new music, very small, rose instead from kitchen clocks, from the whisper of wind along the eaves, from the quick, hesitant steps of a rabbit reconsidering the fence. The town seemed to understand. This was the hour when mischief forgot its shape and turned into kindness, wearing borrowed formality. Even the boldest boys grew suddenly considerate. They rehung a garden gate they had lifted at dusk, set it straighter than before, and tied to its latch a piece of licorice like a repentant ribbon. On a stoop at the corner, an old man who had lost his wife the previous winter set half a loaf upon a second plate by the window and murmured her name like a password that opened a gentler world. The teacher, hat in hand, walked slowly between rooftops and thought about the neighbour standing in his doorway. The idea, no longer a theory, but an act itself, to greet a stranger graciously, to borrow another's role for a moment, and learn the weather inside his heart. He nearly smiled at the scholarly neatness of it, until he saw the chalk flower of apology, and could not. The lesson had sunk into the heavy work of the town. The printer's boy, his pockets still holding fragments of type, a lonely quotation mark, a timid comma, walked beside the ribboned girl down the narrow lane and said in a tone unfit for headlines that sometimes he wished a newspaper could carry a story about how sorrow and play shook hands on nights like this. She listened, and the ember of her earlier thought, fanned by wind, translated itself into another meaning. Lanterns do not conquer darkness. They teach it to sit nearer without frightening anyone. They stopped by the schoolyard, where a plate with 3 apple seeds waited for someone's courage. She smiled at that ancient nonsense, pressed one seed down, and felt nothing except the gentle ritual of choosing, which was, in truth, no choice at all. At the end of the road stood a clapboard house, whose door rarely opened after dark. But tonight a thin seam of light stitched itself beneath the sill, and the air on the porch held the distinct chill of a door recently eased from long stillness. The coal in the girl's chest glowed and drifted closer. The printer's boy stepped beside her, and through the narrow path they saw a figure just within, neither ghost nor giant, only a traveller in a coat of mist, his eyes moving softly, as if testing whether he was welcome. Perhaps he had been turned away from a brighter house, or simply lost his way in a town whose lanes curved like shy questions. The plate on the windowsill, meant for memory, became at once a plate for a living hunger, and before anyone could decide whether this night's hospitality belonged to the dead or the living, the pastor's wife, shawl tightened, having watched from her window, crossed the street lightly as a hush, set another slice of bread upon the dish, and said with courtesy that never hardened into doctrine, "That will do." The man bowed, a bow that thanked both the loaf and the intention that had baked it. He did not enter, only paused a moment in the lamplight, touched the brim of his hat, and moved on. The two young watchers heard the hinge of the hour click softly, as though the night itself had nodded. Itself, or no printed paper would ever carry that part of the story. It would live instead as rumour in the town's marrow, a plausible evidence of that strange faith, that a single patient candle and a quiet plate by a window could keep a doorway's greeting tender through an entire cold month. And if now your own room holds a square of light like that, if your breath has begun to follow the falling tide of these drowsy miles, tell me, from which country are you listening, and what hour is it in your night? These gentle wanderings like to know who keeps them company, and if this quiet companionship soothes you, then you are invited to subscribe to the entire history, so the path between our small lights may grow smoother and sure. Midnight is not far. The train will soon sing again across the hills. The frost will write finer patterns along every fence rail, and a cautious door, one long kept closed, will begin to think of opening, while somewhere, on some windowsill, a small candle will lean its flame toward the glass, as though listening too. Near 11, the town's hush thickened, as if a quilt had been pulled up to the chin of every house, and in that gentled weather, the last reluctant door, its paint flaking like birch bark, its latch bright from a history of hands, finally stirred. It belonged to Miss Calder, who had not opened to callers since her brother sailed west a dozen winters ago and forgot the way back. Children knew her only by the slanted shadow that sometimes crossed her upstairs window, and mothers spoke softly of a piano that had kept its silence since the postman once arrived with bad news that still smelled faintly of rain. Tonight a candle stood at her parlour like a little soldier at ease, and when the latch lifted it made no protest, as though even hinges understand when a quiet has lasted long enough. The ribboned girl and the printer's boy, walking the lane with the careful attention of those who have learned how to listen, paused at the end of Miss Calder's path and felt the hour incline toward them. No summons, no spectacle, only that nearness which teaches a person to breathe more softly. The doorway breathed as well. A slender ribbon of warmer air slipped out, carrying beeswax, old paper, and the shy perfume of roses pressed long ago between hymnal leaves. Miss Calder, hair silver as frost on a pump handle, looked down the path and did not startle. She nodded once, a courtly dip from an earlier kind of evening, and said, almost to the night, that a plate by a window is a promise to whoever needs it most, and promises prefer to be kept. She set a small plate on the threshold with a folded napkin, and half an orange saved from Christmas preserves. The printer's boy, who could not help noticing what things deserved to be set in type, stood very still so that even his thinking would not jostle the arrangement. From the parsonage, the minister's wife watched and felt something loosen at the soft centre of her chest, the place where stubbornness disguises itself as prudence. She had feared for Miss Calder's solitude, the way one fears a candle guttering in a draught, and the sight of that tidy, resolute plate seemed to tie a snug scarf around the knight's throat. The schoolmaster, crossing the green, also paused and entered, into the quiet ledger behind his eyes, another proof that threshold keeping is not merely doctrine, but art. You do not make the old ways justify themselves, you practice them until their meaning arrives. Someone could have argued, of course, there is always a voice ready to say that such gestures edge too close to superstition, that the dead do not want oranges, that the living want sensible hours and sleep, but even the inward debaters fell quiet at the sight of a thin woman placing a plate with both hands and straightening the napkin twice, not as magic or as barter, but as the tender etiquette of remembrance. What if courtesy is the only bridge that truly holds between the known and the guessed at? What if the year's hinge swings best on oiled kindness? Down the lane, the blacksmith shut the livery for certain, and felt the town's metal, hinges, rails, latches, come to one temper. Iron had found its winter voice, a clearer ring under the hammer, and a tighter grain to the file, and he thought, with a craftsman's small superstition, that the night approved. He touched his pocket, where 3 horseshoe nails remained from his earlier gifting, and decided to carry them until thaw, wards not against spirits, but against forgetting to be gentle. A polite wind came and combed the frost, so the ground gleamed in faint ribs. The lantern at the cemetery gate, left to its work, trembled once and steadied. And in the colder doorway, the candle leaned toward the street, as if listening for shoes on the path. None came. Instead, a grey, precise cat, with the concentrated look of a clerk reading figures, materialised from the hedge, sprang to the threshold, inspected the orange gravely, then curled by Miss Calder's slipper, as though summoned by a bell no one had rung. "There you are," she told it, yet the words seemed to answer the night as well. The ribboned girl felt the ember sentence inside her shift and warm her ribs. Perhaps the most faithful arrivals are the smallest, and perhaps the unseen prefer gratitude that asks for no proof. She drew from her pocket the matchbox the printer's boy had given her at the cemetery, shook it once for the friendly rattle, and passed it to Miss Calder with a smile that inquired nothing. The older woman lit a second taper and slipped it behind the glass of the sidelights, so the house wore twin, watchful eyes that blinked at every faint draught. Far off, the last train let down a ribbon of sound across the hills, and in kitchens all over town final plates were rinsed and stood on edge to dry. The printer's boy, whose hands longed to catch the whole hour, felt oddly relieved that no page could hold it. Some stories become truer by remaining unprinted, passed instead from window to window like bowls of warm broth after snow. Perhaps hearing the same conclusion without words, Miss Calder drew her door nearly to and left it where latch meets strike and pauses, half a kiss, half a blessing, and the house altered character for those who can feel such things, becoming less a citadel and more a harbour. The 2 boys, who had set the stolen gate straight, came drifting past, saw the cat enthroned, and walked on without a joke. Mischief had not died. It had only taken off its mask to show the polite face underneath. The schoolmaster, passing close, thought of his note on guising as rehearsal and foresaw, as one sees a bend in a river, a time when the playfulness would gather candy, store-bought costumes, and schedules printed in bold type. He did not call it loss, only metamorphosis, like a tune that keeps its lilt on a newer fiddle. Yet he guessed that certain windows would always keep plates, and a few candles would burn with the old patience. Midnight drew its thumb along the spine of the town. Breath smoked and faded. The surviving pumpkins lowered their flicker to embers, and at the cemetery gate the square lantern lifted once more, not by any hand, but by a courteous wind, so that its light stitched across the names like a seam checked before folding the garment away. The ribboned girl and the printer's boy stood a little longer in the Calder path and listened to the candle speak to the glass in its bright whisper, then turned toward home, step for step, as if walking inside the same sentence. Behind them, Miss Calder's door inched, a fraction nearer to meeting, neither shut nor open, and the cat, having completed whatever tidy office it had been given, lifted its head toward the hedge, as though awaiting someone who might yet, quite late, come up the walk and rest. Midnight, when it finally came, did not clap or call attention to itself. It exhaled, a thin, even breath that slid along the pickets, and laid a last bright glaze on the frost, until every yard looked faintly stitched with silver thread, and in that softened seam, the town seemed to lean a fraction closer to its own beating heart. At the bend in the lane, the ribboned girl and the printer's boy traded the sort of smile given on train platforms, unhurried, accepting that parting is only another kind of threshold, then drifted apart at the pace of snow that has not quite begun. She moved toward her grandmother's gate, with the lantern square of memories steady in her chest. He turned for the press room, with its clean ironed scent, the big wheel sleeping, the cases of type like dark beehives waiting out winter. Miss Calder's door, left almost but not quite latched, breathed a thimble of warmer air with each small draught, and the cat at her slipper rose, stretched with clerical dignity, and padded inside as if to file the evening's report. A sound followed, one piano key, testing the night like a fingertip testing tea, then another until a tune gathered itself by degrees. Hesitant at first, then sure in the way a person knows the path from bed to stove, in the dark, not a hymn, exactly, nor a reel, but the remembered weather of a song that had once lived in that house when letters still arrived with impatient stamps. At his desk, the schoolmaster paused mid-sentence and smiled because he recognized not the notes but the shape of them, the way all human music meanders toward a hearth. In the margin, in a hand he would not be able to read by morning, he added that ceremonies are only songs the hands remember. Down the road the blacksmith sat on his stoop and rubbed a thumb along a horseshoe nail, as if smoothing a thought. The iron had taken on its winter tightness, and the night, listening, seemed to approve the patience of craft. He thought of bonfires his mother had described, of people leaping and laughing to bless the months ahead, and he understood, without any scholar's footnote, that the fire had come indoors here, into stoves and lanterns and the low banking of coals, yet the leap remained, in apologies chalked and unchalking, in plates set by windows, in the brave unbolting of a door. The minister's wife, not yet in bed, stood again at her pane. Peaches on their saucer kept a quiet glow, like small stored summers, and she found herself shaping a psalm with no sound, tasting apples and old phrases, the kind that say mercy may arrive, dressed as ordinary bread. At the shop, the printer's boy let himself in, struck a match, and coaxed a lamp into its steady pool of honeyed light. The press waited like a patient animal, large and at rest. Ink-remembering fingers lifted a few stray sorts, an orphaned ampersand, a shy comma, a capital O with a hairline nick at the rim. Nick. He set them in a line on the stone, and without quite deciding to, arranged a private headline for no paper. Once and again, and almost laughed at himself, then didn't, feeling how newsprint misses the best news when it arrives shaped like a breath shared on a porch, or a long stubborn latch finally yielding. He took the tiny row down, dropped each piece home to its case, and let the lamp burn another minute for the moth warming its small wings. Across town, the ribboned girl slipped in at her grandmother's and was careful with the latch. A cup by the stove wore the thinnest skin of cream, and a heel of bread rested in a clean cloth, as if to say that thresholds include kitchens, and returning is a rite no less tender than going out. She listened. to the piano's timid bravery drifting on the air, to the glass ticking faintly as it traded cold with the room, to her own breath choosing a calmer measure. She thought not as a verdict, more as a candle turned low, that the year did not cleave with a sword tonight. It turned like a page, and if one paid kind attention, one might hear the leather whisper along the spine. Beyond the houses, the train let out its last thinnest ribbon of sound across the hills, and then released the seam. Silence gathered itself, and wore the moon like a shawl. Debate, ever eager come daylight, rolled to its other side and slept. Was this truly Samhain, under newer names, or the church's borrowed Eve, or simply America quilting with familiar patches? The arguments would wake, as they should, but here, in the tender middle, practice kept the floor while theory closed its eyes. On the green, 2 pumpkins guttered to pink coal, and then to a smoke so delicate it seemed embarrassed to be seen. One of the boys who had spared the cooper's barrel came back with a bucket, doused the last ember, and, moved by a thought he could not name, set the bucket neatly by the stoop instead of kicking it over for a laugh. The schoolmaster capped his ink and let the page stand at its unfinished grace. Tomorrow he would teach spelling without uttering the word threshold, and yet his students, with chestnut on their sleeves and a strange patience in the air, might learn the lesson anyway. At the parsonage, the minister returned to stand beside his wife. Neither spoke. The Peaches kept their small vigil, the plate by the window having been briefly pressed into service by a living stranger, resumed its older watch without jealousy. Miss Calder's tune, after several quiet circuits of the parlour, while the cat conducted with its tail, settled into 3 held chords, and a sighing foot lifted from the pedal. The candle behind the side lights blinked once and steadied, as if agreeing the house had done enough for one night. In the hush that followed, soft as a benediction, the ribboned girl snuffed the stove's blue whisper, touched the matchbox in her pocket as if to thank it, and went to the window where Frost had written its fern script. With one fingertip she traced a tiny door, only an outline, on the pane. It held a moment, an emblem of passage, then melted under her warmth, leaving a dark small oval in the white that looked very much like an opening, beyond which the street lay, as it always had, and yet somehow more expectant, as if the night were listening for a footstep not yet taken, a letter not yet slid beneath a stubborn door, the first, barely their hush of snow preparing its 1,000 quiet arrivals. Toward 3, when the night thinned to its sheerest veil, and even the clock seemed to breathe between one tick and the next, the town lay in a quiet so attentive it felt like water holding perfectly still. In that hush, the small click of a latch from the house that almost never invited footsteps travelled far beyond its size, and the ribboned girl, dozing in her grandmother's chair, opened her eyes with the soft certainty that a page had just turned. She rose without hurry, careful not to startle the thought gathering inside her, and went to the window where the frost had written its fern script, leaving clear ovals wherever curious fingers had earlier drawn little doors. Outside the lane wore its pale nap of cold, and from Miss Calder's house a tapering thread of melody drifted, not a song any longer, but its afterglow, the quiet that follows when a grief is returned to its shelf and veiled with muslin. At the press-room corner, a thin seam of darkness told her the printer's boy had indeed shuttered the lamp, though she could almost feel, like heat held in a cooling oven, the care he had left behind among his silent cases of type. Far off, a small weather attempted itself, just a pinch of dry snow, unsure whether to fall, and the cat in Miss Calder's window lifted its exact face as if taking attendance. The door that had spent the evening breathing settled an inch wider, and nothing grand entered, only a braid of night air laced with the powder smell of first snow. and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco, the kind that clings to winter coats too long kept on pegs. A shape paused at the threshold, more shadow than figure, and if anyone had stood near enough to name it, their tongue would have folded into quiet, not from fear, but from that old etiquette that makes room for the unexpected. Miss Calder, who had neither slept nor paced, stood in her parlour with hands folded at her waist, and a patience long in the baking. When the draught touched the candle behind the side lights, the twin flames bowed and righted themselves, two small courtiers, and the house's breath, warm and careful, extended to meet the colder breath at the door. Perhaps a traveller would step in. Perhaps the night itself would sit politely on the mat. But the hinge had answered, and that answer moved along the lane like the faintest bell carried on someone's palm. The schoolmaster, waking with a crick in his neck and the word threshold printed backward on his skin where his wrist had rested, went to his window, and in that honest fog between dream and thought believed he could see the town's ideas hung like constellations. Courtesy, rehearsal, remembrance, each star a kitchen custom, a chalked apology, a plate under a clean cloth. He laughed once, soundlessly, and told himself that by morning he would be sensible again, for now he took down the page on folk survivals and wrote in the margin that sometimes a community keeps a feast because it has learned to breathe more easily with it than without it, and scholars can file their arguments in a later drawer. The blacksmith, a man sparing with talk, woke to know the iron in his shop was colder than a hand could bear, and somehow friendlier than a week ago. Winter iron accepts the hammer with a clearer ring, and he liked thinking, without saying, that the night had tempered more than metal. He pulled on his boots and stepped out to test the latches, listening for the tiny ticks that tell a craftsman a hinge is pleased. And in the delicate frost on his step, he traced a horseshoe with one fingertip, a child's sign, wiping it away before anyone could catch him at it. The printer's boy, though he had doused the lamps, lay in the cot behind the press and found sleep slow to come. He felt for the orphaned ampersand he kept in his pocket and the shy comma he could never bear to melt back into the pot. Together they made punctuation the paper would never set. Anne and that promises a breath that lingers, and he grinned in the dark because certain nights require such grammar. He thought of the ribboned girl's ember sentence and hoped it would keep warm enough to carry her through winter. Then he drifted into a dream where trains stitched towns together with bright thread, and every station master tended a lantern whose light had no edge. Under the minister's roof, two peaches slept themselves ordinary on their saucer while he and his wife, dozing at last, tilted toward each other like bookends that had finished their day's work. The plate by the window kept its cloth as though memory were a guest who preferred to arrive unobserved, and if one listened too closely one might have heard the word mercy roll once through the room like a bead in a pocket and come to rest. The ribboned girl touched the matchbox in her apron, a friendly tick of wood on wood, like a cricket, and the thought that had been turning all evening finally showed its face. Light is not the opposite of dark, not here. It is how dark learns its manners. A lantern is a chair pulled up, so night can share the story. A candle is the door held gently between rooms, so air can mingle without a draught. She smiled at the braided foolishness and wisdom of it, and felt her breath fall into a calmer measure, as though an inner hinge had been oiled. She drew one last tiny door on the frosted pane, habit now and benediction, and watched it open into a clear oval framing the street like a miniature portrait. Through it she saw Miss Calder lift her chin, neither beckoning nor refusing, only enlarging the room for whatever might arrive. The figure on the step shifted, and the pipe tobacco ghost of a winter coat sweetened and thinned, as if morning were already practicing its quiet alchemy at the edges of things. The cat turned once in a disciplined circle and sat, a grey punctuation at the end of the threshold. By daylight, scholars would sketch tidy descents. Samhain braided to All Hallows, braided to an American evening of pumpkins and paper masks. And they would not be wrong. Yet none of those lines could keep the scent of first snow or the way a town's shoulders relax together at 2 and 3, and so the diagrams would stand, useful and insufficient, while practice continued shaping the body of the year. The train withheld even the rumour of its breath. The sky considered light but did not commit, and along the fences the frost wrote a finer hand than before, a cursive no scribe could match, underlining the quiet path from the cemetery's square lantern to Miss Calder's open inch of door to the stove, where a blue whisper waited to be woken. In that underlined stillness, the town chose, without vote, without notice, to keep watch a little longer, until another soft hinge turned, until a letter slid under a door, with the sound of a bird alighting, until the first ping grain of daylight settled on the cat's ear and made it flick, as if to say, now. Closer to 4 o'clock, when night and morning still shared the same thin breath, a filament of hush slipped through the lane and drew every small thing into listening. The clock springs pausing between decisions, the stove coals holding their red like a kept secret, the frost lettering along fences brightening by a hair, and in that almost silence, the inch of door at Miss Calder's house gave its softest reply, a paper's whisper on wood, the tender scrape of something slid across a threshold by a careful hand. The cat, clerkly in its duties, rose to inspect the offering with a whiskers ceremony. In the parlour, a single piano string trembled once, as though some passing memory had brushed the instrument awake. The ribboned girl, who had not truly slept, felt the sound arrive inside her, like a snowflake landing on the tongue, cool, vanishing, yet understood all the same. She stood, wrapped her shawl with the unhurried grace of someone long practised in winter, and went to the glass. The oval she had cleared in the frost had filmed again, but not completely. There remained a lens the size of a locket, through which she could see Miss Calder's silhouette crossing the parlour, and kneeling, thin as a bookmark, to lift what the night had offered. The woman did not reach quickly. She took 2 slow breaths, the kind one takes before reading aloud to an empty room. At the press, the printer's boy stirred on his cot with the strange sense that language had made a quiet decision somewhere. He could not say why, only that some headline he would never set had found its punctuation. He stood, laced his boots, and stepped into the lane, where the air carried the faint talc of almost snow, and the rails on the far hill held their briefest gleam. The blacksmith, who had the habit of waking once to listen to the health of his iron, opened his door a crack and heard that same papery hush, and though he could not see the object, he nodded, as if some hinge, not metal but something like it, had just been oiled. The schoolmaster, lighting no lamp, found his pen in the dark, and with his palm for a desk, wrote 3 words he half remembered from a Gaelic gloss, and half invented to suit the hour: threshold, hospitality, remembrance, dots between them like stepping stones. Later, the town would argue origins again, Samhain, or church, or some American quilt. But here, at the seam of the 2 lights, practice once more out-argued theory, with quiet proof. A plate laid out, a prank turned into apology, a door left unlatched past habit, and now this small paper slid across with care. Miss Calder, still on her knees, unfolded the thing. No miracle, only a letter that had travelled an odd, patient road, the way some messages wander until both sender and receiver are finally ready to meet. The paper was thin, the ink browned at the edges the way tea stains linen. The ribboned girl could not see the words, only the tilt of the reader's head, the hand that rose to cover her mouth for a heartbeat, not in shock, but in recognition. When the hand lowered, a breath left the room like a bird leaving a sill. No commotion, only less weight in the air, and the candle behind the sidelight steadied, as if to agree that the house's weather had changed. The printer's boy came as far as the path and stopped, hat in his hands. He knew, as all good typesetters do, when not to set a mark. Miss Calder looked up, saw the two young watchers, girl at the window, boy on the path, and gave that same small bow she had given the knight permission to witness, not to enter. The cat, satisfied that the paper held neither fish nor threat, made a small approving circle and stationed itself at the hinge. Perhaps the letter had arrived from a shipboard desk or a way station where lost mail dwells, until fate corrects its address. Perhaps it came from a clerk in the dead letter office whose tidy soul could not bear to leave a certain envelope unmatched any longer. Whatever its journey, it had chosen this hour for its landing, and the town, trained all evening in the craft of tenderness, received the news without clamour, just as snow receives footfalls and holds them without injury. The minister's wife, waking to an absence of tension in the room, as if a tightened string had been tuned, rose and went to the window. She did not yet lift the cloth from the plate. Mercy, she thought, sometimes prefers to keep its veil until morning. Beside her, peaches slept on their saucer like moons that had decided to be fruit again. She smiled and let the smile become a prayer with no words at all. The blacksmith stepped onto his stoop, and seeing the printer's boy, lifted 2 fingers in greeting. The boy answered, and neither spoke. Iron held its breath in the livery, pleased. Far off, the tracks caught a pearl line, the east thinking of light, and along every fence the frost wrote a finer hand, underscoring, as on a proof, the line that connected gate to door to window to stove to bed. The schoolmaster, feeling foolish and then not caring, opened his own door and placed a thimble of milk on the step. Not doctrine, only sympathy with the neighbouring plates, and in the humbleness of that act he discovered a chapter he would never publish. That a feast is a town's way of teaching itself the posture of welcome until it can hold it without strain. The ribboned girl, moved by a certainty kind as bread, slipped her feet into boots and crossed the lane. She did not go up the walk. She stood by the gate with the lantern that had watched the cemetery, and with the friendly rattle of a matchbox, she woke the wick. The little square climbed back into light, and the names it had carried earlier returned for a moment, like friends who know when to leave a room. The printer's boy, catching her thought, took from his pocket the orphaned ampersand and shy comma, set them for a heartbeat on the post, and a promise, a breath, a patience, then tucked them away again before the gesture could harden into a story he would later regret telling. Miss Calder, letter in her lap, rose and came to the door, opening it wide enough for a thread of warmer air to reach the 2 watchers at the gate. She did not read aloud. She did not need to. She only said, in a voice with a winter creak in it, "It took its time," and smiled in a way that made the cat close its eyes, satisfied with the accounting. Dawn, not yet visible but already at work, laid one pale finger along the bottom edge of the world, and the night, perceiving the courtesy, began to gather its shawl. Pumpkins on porches sighed into smoke, leaving behind a faint, clean scent. The boys who had chalked apology would wake with cuffs smelling of licorice and a confusing pride. The blacksmith would lay a nail on the mantel and decide not to say why. The minister's wife would keep the plate covered until the first sparrow thumped the sill. The schoolmaster would feel ridiculous again, and then less so, watching a cat take a magistrate stroll across the green, and the printer's boy, finishing nothing, would be glad. The ribboned girl's ember sentence, warmed all through the hours, at last took its shape, not a proclamation, only this: keep a door gentle, and the year will turn itself. She did not say it aloud. She held it, the way one holds a match in wind, cupped and careful. Then, because the hinge of the night had found its perfect swing, she lifted the lantern from the gate and breathed it out with the smallest sound, and the square darkened without fear. Beyond the hedges, something pale began to unroll itself across the fields, the first thought of morning, the first shimmer along the rails, and the lane, newly legible, waited with the patience of a page before the first word is written. While in Miss Calder's doorway, the letter lay upon the hall table like a promise finally arrived, its edges lifting slightly in the draught, as if eager to be read again when the light ripened. Dawn didn't so much break as loosen its knots, a soft untying along the fields until the fences shed their silver and turned back into honest, grain-veined wood. The lane rose out of its dream by slow degrees, and in that gentle lifting, the night's quiet handiwork showed itself like pale threads a seamstress forgot to trim. Miss Calder's letter lay where she had placed it on the hall table, corners tipping in the draught, while she stood beside it with one hand resting over the other, not yet reading again, simply learning the house's new weather. The piano that had found its voice at midnight kept the hush of an after-song, the way a bird sits with feathers smoothed, content to have sung. In the sidelights, the candle behind the glass held a modest posture, no display now, only a steady ember, while the cat, clerkly as ever, completed a last inspection of the threshold, and then installed itself with great dignity on the runner, as if minutes required supervision. Across the lane, the ribboned girl and the printer's boy waited at the gate, as the sky took on its first shy colour. Their lantern had sighed out moments earlier, smoke fine as a loosening hair, and they felt the small good weight of having kept watch without claiming what they had watched, the quiet satisfaction of holding a door for a stranger who never sees the hand, yet passes more easily because of it. The girl touched the matchbox in her pocket and did not rattle it. The sentence the wind had given her had set like clear glass: keep a door gentle, and the year will turn itself. She did not treat it as a motto or creed. It felt more like a habit. Fingers learn how to lift a latch, fold a napkin, set a plate where memory eats. After a while, the printer's boy breathed out a grin and said, not to her exactly, nor to the dawn, but to the seam between them. Once and again, and she understood, he meant the night would return with its quiet errands, that what had happened was both singular and part of a pattern. He would not print the phrase, but he would carry it in his pocket beside the shy comma and the orphaned ampersand like a charm against hurry. At the livery, the blacksmith swung his doors open in a practised arc, listened for the hinge's agreeable tick, and nodded. Iron's winter voice had sharpened overnight, and he set 3 horseshoe nails on the windowsill like little sentries before, embarrassed by his own ceremony, sweeping them back into his palm and pocketing them for luck. He would tell no one, and yet, later, when some colt shied at a shadow, his fingers would find those nails and steady. The schoolmaster stepped onto the green with his hat in his hand because morning felt like a room where one should remove it. In his pocket lay a note folded out of the restless hours: threshold, hospitality, remembrance, dots between like stepping stones. And though he had planned no lesson on festivals to suit anyone's propriety, he suspected his first word on the blackboard would be courtesy, a small doctrine no one could argue down. He noticed with a private joy. The boys who had chalked apology and tied licorice to a gate were up early. There they were, sleeves pushed, scrubbing their own chalk with wetted rags, laughing at the way chalk turns to milk under cloth. When they finished, they opened the cooper's gate, lifted the dry barrel properly to its stand, and set beside it a new, straighter ribbon, the rest of the calico, without comment. Mischief had learned its manners, and felt no weaker for it. The minister's wife drew the cloth from the plate at last, because a sparrow had thumped the sill and peered in with the frankness of birds asking for crumbs. She moved the peaches to a cool shelf, slid the bread into a small toasting rack, and thought, with a wordless warmth, that a vigil had been kept and could now become breakfast, the sacred trick of changing form without losing meaning. She would not speak to her husband of Samhain or survivals. She would tell him gently that Miss Calder had opened her door and a letter had arrived, and he would nod with the careful reserve he wore when the world offered scenes that resisted argument. Along the far hill the rails gathered. First a pearl line, then a silver one. At 9 a train would come, with its confident breath and newspapers full of smaller news than the night had made. And the printer's boy, who would set those front pages with his usual accuracy, felt no scorn, only a deeper tenderness for headlines no press can print. Apology accepted, door unlatched, plate remembered, letter come home. The frost script on the windows thinned, its fern alphabet loosening loop by loop back into water. The ribboned girl traced one last small door on the glass and watched it open into a clear oval through which morning could enter. She felt like a traveller who, after waiting without complaint at a crossing for the train to pass, sees the gate lift, and the ordinary road seem new again for having been withheld. She would carry that near joy into the day's work, sweeping porch steps, mending a stocking, gathering kindling. The ember sentence at her ribs would not blaze or orate. It would simply keep her hands unwilling to slam a door, unwilling to forget the second slice on a plate. At last Miss Calder took the letter in both hands and read. There were dates, a harbour's name, an apology for years, a promise to write again if Providence allowed, and between the lines the unmistakable cadence of a beloved's breath. When she finished, she closed her eyes and stood as one does on a threshold before stepping out, counting familiar stones, learning the light, readying the foot. She did not weep. Her lips shaped the name that had been absent from her rooms, and the house seemed to echo it with her gently in the air near the stairs and along the stiff fall of the piano curtains. The cat, still and capable, flicked an ear as if to sign the ledger. Delivery completed. The town which had breathed together through the thin hours exhaled. The river, the true one, and the one running underwards, took up its sound again. The first wagons creaked. A pie crust broke, like quiet snow under a knife. The day's bonnet tied itself softly under the chin. Scholars would wake and marshal their arguments as scholars must. Children would wake, remembering only apples and laughter and a friendlier door. The blacksmith would strike and hear a cleaner ring. The schoolmaster would chalk a single word and let it stand. The minister's wife would set a plate for a traveller who might arrive hungry at an unmarked hour, and the printer's boy, passing Miss Calder's house on his way to wake the press, would tip his hat brim to the cat and to the letter's invisible brightness by the door. Somewhere behind the hedges, the last pale ribbon of night tucked itself away, leaving the faintest gleam on the fence rails like a reminder thread, while inside the hall, the letter, its paper browned at the edges, like a baked crust, lifted once more in the draught, as if preparing to take a small step of its own toward the deeper light within the room. Morning widened its shawl over the fields until the frost slipped back into the shaded corners and the fences took up their ordinary brown again. Yet ordinary had been altered, as if the grain in every board had learned a new patience. The ribboned girl swept her grandmother's stoop in slow, companionable strokes, leaving the broom a heartbeat above the step between passes, a small courtesy to the quiet, as though she might startle it into hiding. And when she was done, she set the broom against the jamb with its bristles tucked in, like a guest with tidy feet. Across the lane, the printer's boy opened the shop and let the big door lean into its hinge until the agreeable click arrived. He warmed the press with his palm, the way a man gentles a horse, then set the morning's small headlines: timber auction, Saturday, a lecture on the constellations in the church hall, new kettles at the general store, none of it heavy enough to dent the hush that had settled into the town's joints. In his pocket, the orphaned ampersand and the shy comma rode now by habit, not talismans so much as reminders that language breathes. Once, while the rollers turned, he touched them and felt a whisper of the lane's midnight grammar. And a promise. A breath, a patience, thread softly through his morning. The blacksmith tied on his apron and coaxed a thin blue tongue from the forge. Iron, tempered by the long cold, answered with a cleaner ring, and between strikes he glanced toward Miss Calder's house and allowed himself a private nod, as if congratulating a neighbour's hinge for sound work. The 3 nails in his pocket made a friendly weight, and when a jittery colt shied at the clap of a far-off screen door, he steadied its flank and felt his composure move back through his hands like heat. The schoolmaster arrived early to the empty room and wrote courteous in a neat chalk-quiet hand at the top of the slate. Beneath it, he added 3 smaller words: threshold, hospitality, remembrance, then stood back as if he'd opened a window to feel air pass through the idea. He nearly rubbed it out for fear of sentimentality, but the sight made a practical warmth in him, and he left it, deciding even children know when a door is handled gently. The minister's wife toasted the saved slice and set a second beside it, a habit now kept without embarrassment. She carried one with coffee to her husband and said, in a tone that leaves room for other views, that a letter had come to Miss Calder at first light. He listened and said, "It is well when old things find their way home." The peaches waited cool in the pantry, ordinary again, which felt like a blessing of the homelier kind. Miss Calder made a deliberate morning of it. She boiled water in the little kettle with the hairline crack and took from a drawer the small tablecloth trimmed in narrow ladderwork. She placed a cup and saucer on the hall table where the letter rested and smiled, briefly, at the cat, who sat with the air of a clerk satisfied the papers had finally reached the right desk. When she lifted the cup, soot in the sidelights drew a faint ellipse on the saucer, and the shape pleased her, the echo of last night's vigil returning as daylight geometry. 2 boys, sleep-eyed, liquorish on their cuffs, came to the Coopers awkward as colts, asked if help was wanted, then rolled a clean hoop without knocking anything over. The Cooper, who had watched their midnight scrubbing through a curtain, accepted it, without praise, that might have frightened the moment. On the green, 2 last pumpkins sat like lantern-bearers in retirement. Their carved smiles collapsed into kind wrinkles. A woman with a pail and a rag cleaned the bobbing tub and hummed a scrap of tune that had been a reel last night and now wished to be a lullaby. And no one told it could not be both. A few town scholars, alert to their daylight charge, began outlining opinions for supper. Well, the Irish customs, the church calendar, the American appetite for costume. And the schoolmaster, hearing them at the post office, smiled and did not disagree. He only added gently that whatever its pedigree, the thing had taught the town to hold its breath together. which seemed utility enough to earn its keep, the printer's boy slipped one extra line into the final column. Not a sermon, only a small patient note. Neighbours are reminded that gates lifted for merriment last night should be returned this morning. Kindness is a festival that happens after the festival. He doubted anyone would note the authorship. He hoped they would note the use. The ribboned girl carried in kindling and paused at the stove, listening to the blue whisper collect its steady monotone. She laid the matchbox on the shelf by the kettle, as carefully as setting a violin back in its case, and she thought of her ember sentence, until it felt less like a sentence than a stitch she could take again and again through ordinary cloth. Keep a door gentle, and the year will turn itself. She did not imagine she had invented it. She understood herself as a courier. The wind had spoken, she had carried, the morning would distribute. Down by the tracks, a crewman tested a brake with 2 soft pushes and declared the 9 o'clock ready. When the train arrived, a few travellers shook off snow that had only considered falling and studied the town's faces for its mood. They saw people going about ordinary hours with a quiet that suggested something set right, and they folded that observation without comment into the day's pocket. In the parlour, with the thin piano, Miss Calder read the letter once more and slid it, with a steadiness that honoured its fragility, under a book pressed with roses. She lifted the lid, struck the faintest chord with the heel of her hand, and closed it again, satisfied the instrument knew it was not forgotten. At the door she returned the plate to its small table, no longer a bargain, simply a posture, and drew a breath with room in it. Noon would come, and errands. Someone would jar the softness and leave a gate cockeyed. Someone else would straighten it without scolding. Debate would take its proper chair at supper and speak, and practice would sit beside it without jealousy. Yet, even as the day busied itself, a fine thread from the night held, like hidden basting in a hem, binding the cemetery's square hook, the parsonage window, the schoolhouse slate, the livery's hinges, the shop's quiet comma, and the matchbox on a stove shelf, into one patient stitch, while outside, on a fence rail, a remnant of frost kept shining in a line no wider than a cat's whisker, as if some small, attentive part of morning were still waiting for another gentle door to open somewhere down the road. Afternoon's small errands, sweeping, mending, setting kettles to their comfortable simmer, gave way to an easy hour when talk travels without needing to arrive. In that loosened light, the older threads beneath the town's ways surfaced like patterns in a well-worn quilt, and people found themselves telling, less to prove than to remember, their preferred reasons a face belongs in a lantern, and a door stays courteous when the year turns. On her porch, the ribboned girl's grandmother drew a thimble over her fingertip and offered the tale she'd been given as a child of a trickster with winterish pockets, stingy, clever, unpinnable, who bargained poorly with both heaven and its opposite, and was sent to walk dark roads with a single coal in a hollowed root. In her telling, the coal warmed rather than burned, and the traveller's punishment softened into a task, to teach the night to be less frightening by wearing a small steady heart. Across the lane the blacksmith gave his county Antrim version, an old turnip carved to warn more than welcome, a face that told trouble it had been seen, and he liked that both meanings could lean on the same fence without quarrelling. The printer's boy, after a morning of dutiful lines about kettles and auctions, listened from the door frame and admitted, in a voice closer to private than print, that he preferred the guiding story to the scolding one, light as a chair pulled out, not a fist. The schoolmaster, who had chalked courtesy and watched it behave handsomely on the slate all day, smiled and added that in some ages a cake did the work, now managed by a candle, soul cakes traded for verses and blessings. Sugared bread pressed into palms where today's small wrapped sweets will go. The minister's wife said quietly she treasured those cakes for how they turned desire toward giving rather than getting, and practical as it was, the town found it easy to love a custom that fed both sides of the threshold. Miss Calder, having folded the letter beneath a book and let the house breathe around it until the air learned the new shape, stood with her door open now as posture, not display, and offered a neighbour's child a thin slice of last year's preserved orange, while she told, the gentlest variant, that the old bonfire sputtered across the ocean, and learning manners as it came ashore, turned into lamps and parlour stoves and a blue whisper in the grate, that the leaping once performed in fields became something inward here, apologies chalked and unchalking, gates rehung straighter, plates kept waiting. The cat, clerk emeritus of thresholds, approved this etymology by closing its eyes. In the general store, where rope, coffee, and new tin made a community of smells, a traveller from the north traded his family's version, mummers in masquerade, door-to-door merriment, songs hung in rooms like garlands, and an older man from the docks answered with memories of All Souls lamps in window after window along the coast, each flame a bead on a string of remembering. The printer's boy, fingers gloved in their usual ink, caught himself sketching a small taxonomy no one had requested, faces that warn, faces that welcome, lamps that bid the strange pass by, lamps that invite the familiar to sit, cakes for souls, cakes for children, masks to confuse, masks to rehearse kindness. And he laughed and let the list go like smoke, out the door and up into weather where it belonged. A brief debate, daylight's polite habit, sprang and softened. Did the church borrow the feast or lend it? Did the gales preserve beneath the calendar a fire the calendar never wholly contained? Was America simply a patient seamstress with a big table and a fondness for piecing? The schoolmaster's answer that truth prefers plural pleased no one who wanted victory and satisfied everyone who wanted supper, and in any case the kettle needed minding. The ribboned girl, who had held last night's ember sentence until it became muscle memory, keep a door gentle, and the year will turn itself, sat on the step with an apple, and listened as the versions drifted across the lane. She understood, without saying, that stories live not because they agree, but because they consent to share a porch, that a single lantern may wear a dozen names and none be wrong so long as the light remains patient. She thought of the letter's papery whisper at the Calder threshold, and how certain hours ask not who is correct, but who is kind. By late afternoon, as shadows grew long and fence posts stretched across the grass, like thoughtful men, talk shifted from origins to purposes, and here the varieties collapse beautifully into one, to carry the living across the thinning place, without hurry, to give grief a chair that isn't the bed, to let mischief practice apology until it learns the step, to make room for travellers, visible and otherwise, who arrive with winter on their coats, to remind children that masks are not only for hiding, but for learning other faces, to train even iron, hinges and latches, to open without complaint. Somewhere a fiddler tried a daylight version of the night's tune and found it wanted a different step. The pumpkins on the green, retired and wrinkled, looked like elders approving from their chairs. The minister's wife, drying the last plate at the window, whispered mercy so softly the glass kept it for a while. And when the sun slid down to that patient line where the rails catch it like a ribbon, the town understood evening would come again. Less ceremonial than last night, perhaps, yet carrying the same invitation to be gentle with thresholds. Doors would close, yes, but not sharply. A letter would be read a third time, without the ink changing, and yet, with the meaning ripening, a cat would tour the hedges with the solemnity of a magistrate, and somewhere between lane and gate, an old story would put on its newest face and be recognised all the same. As the air cooled, and the first lamp was drawn a notch higher, the ribboned girl balanced her apple core on the fence, and watched light collect in Miss Calder's side lights like small patient moons. And beyond the last garden, where fields begin to guess us at frost again, a pale path of dew lifted its face to the coming dusk, as if waiting for footsteps it could remember but not name. Toward evening, the air took on that forgiving blue that folds a day without scolding it, and the town, having laid down its stories like cards no one needed to win, returned to its chores with a softness that made even small noises sound respectful. The ribboned girl walked to the pump with a pail and listened to the handle's rhythm, up, down, a hinge reciting its lesson, and thought again of thresholds as a work rather than wonder, each lift of the arm a courtesy paid to water. Across the lane, the printer's boy, sleeves rolled, set a last form for the morning sheet, and wiped the stone so clean the letters looked like pennies at the bottom of a clear creek. He could feel in his hands a difference he could not name, as if the night's grammar, and a promise, a breath, a patience, had turned to muscle and would now steady his composing stick whenever headlines tried to hurry him. In the parsonage, the minister's wife laid a cloth at the window and set a simple plate upon it, as if placing an idea where the room could see it. Not invitation, not bargain, merely posture, and when she struck the match, the brief sulphur brightening felt like a bow to both past and present. The peaches slept cool on a pantry shelf, happily demoted from symbol to fruit, the best direction symbols can travel. The blacksmith hammered, with winter tact, strikes measured, pauses just long enough to hear iron's answer, and when a traveller's gig creaked in with the tired wheel, he judged the wear by ear and mended it, while talking about nothing at all, the weather's change, the rail's pearl line at dawn, the fiddle that had wanted a prayer last night. He accepted a coin and a grateful nod, then tucked one of his 3 pocket nails into the gig's small toolbox without remark, pleased by the idea of a quiet ward travelling the same road that had brought a letter home. The schoolmaster, locking his door, glanced once more at the word ghosting the slate, courtesy, and brushed it away with felt. The faint chalk breath it left in the air looked to him like a principle learning to go without its sign, and he smiled, thinking some lessons are truer once you can't point to them. Miss Calder, having read the letter again, with the kind of attention that waters memory, instead of drowning it, placed it in an envelope she had neatly mended along the edge. She slid it under the piano's closed lid, a temporary harbour, and left the door open to the evening so the house could wear its new posture plainly. The cat, finishing its tour, hedge fence step, sat at the threshold with the expression of a clerk prepared for after-hours callers who never make trouble. At the Coopers, the 2 boys who had scrubbed their apology stood with hands in their pockets, longing for mischief the way a runner longs for the hill he's learned to climb. Finding none that didn't bruise, they whittled harmless curls from a fallen branch and let the shavings fall like confetti on the stoop, and that too felt like a skill. In kitchens, kettles rehearsed their low songs. In yards, sheets came in from the lines with the cool of early dark folded neatly into them. The lane filled with that quiet consent people give to dusk, each porch lifting a lamp a notch as though all the lamps were parts of one instrument learning its scale. A few habitual scholars, reluctant to let a good argument sleep, revived it gently. You must allow, sir, that the soul cake is ancestor to the candy bag, or surely the bonfire crouched and became a hearth when it crossed the water. But nobody's voice sharpened. There was a sense abroad that the why had little work tonight, that the for whom held the floor, for the grieving, for the travelling, for shy kindnesses that prefer masks before they can dare a face. Stepping out to breathe the ink from his hands, the printer's boy looked down the street and saw the cemetery gate, a dark, ordinary rectangle again. The square lantern had been brought in and set on a kitchen shelf, smaller now than under stars, yet its glass kept the faintest rune of soot, a memory of watch that made the grandmother wipe once and then stop, deciding to leave the note in the margin. Passing with her pail, the ribboned girl lifted the lantern and held it to the window. The air outside tilted toward cold in that exploratory way weather uses when it thinks of changing rooms. She did not light the wick. Some nights ask for flame, some for patience, but her reflection in the darkened pane looked for a breath, like someone older, someone who had learned to keep a door gentle even in speech. She set the lantern down and stepped onto the stoop, just as the first snow that wasn't a rumour began. Not a fall, only a rehearsal. A few distinct flecks choosing fences to introduce themselves upon, a dusting on the pump's iron throat, a faint salt across the lane. Above, the sky kept its blue but put on a quieter face, and the rails along the hill accepted a white breath without boasting of it. Seeing the flakes, Miss Calder reached for a shawl with an ease that suggested the house remembered winters that had not been lonely. She stood in a doorway and looked toward the cemetery, not to call anything back, but to check the length of the town's seam, the run of hearths, the measured gap to the gate, the place a person might pause if the weather thickened. The cat inspected a single snowflake whose geometry failed to meet its standards, and then permitted the evening to proceed. The minister and his wife took a slow turn on the green and spoke of small things, a parishioner's new baby, a widow's wood pile, the way the boys had chosen carry-over tip this year. When they came to Miss Calder's door, they did not mention the letter, but she saw in the lift of their hats that they understood how to cross a threshold without crowding it. As lamps found their proper brightness, the printer's boy called good night to the blacksmith, who answered with 2 taps on the anvil. An old signal, older than either of them, meaning, all's well enough. The schoolmaster, watching as he drew his curtains, felt the town learning its chords. Call, response, rest. And then, a small peculiarity, so quiet it would vanish anywhere else. From beyond the tracks came a single bell, not the train's, but a handbell, rung twice with a careful distance between meanings. The sound walked the frost and reached the lane like a message from a schoolyard that had misplaced recess. The ribboned girl looked up. The printer's boy stepped into his doorway. Miss Calder's cat cocked an ear with professional interest. It was likely nothing. A farmer calling in strayed cows, a child playing church with a tin clapper. But the timbre had that particular ask that makes a town listen for a third strike and measure itself between the second and what might come next. The third did not come. Snow ticked the pump handle. Breath showed when spoken. Somewhere a fiddle tuned and then thought better of it. The evening, holding its hinge with the same courtesy the night had taught, waited, while beyond the hedges, near the bend where the lane turns toward the river path, a figure paused in the blue light, hat in hand, as if deciding whether to bring something, news, need, gratitude, up to a door that had learned how to receive. The bell never struck a third time. Instead, its earlier notes seemed to keep sounding inward, widening like a circle under ice, and within that quiet widening the figure at the bend, hat in hand, coat dusted with the day's trial of snow, stood as still as a fence post in blue light, then drew a breath you could almost hear, and came up the lane at an unboastful pace. the gait of someone who has learned to arrive without taking space. He was no stranger in the way strangers advertise themselves, no glint of novelty, no dust of far roads, yet no porch claimed him at once either. He wore the ordinary look of a man who belongs nowhere noisily and everywhere gently. Boots that knew these boards, a sleeve twice mended with care, the square economy of someone long trusted with letters and parcels and therefore with thresholds. The printer's boy, recognising a cousin to the post in that measured stride, felt a pocket-warm sympathy and kept to his doorway, not from caution but from courtesy, leaving the man free to choose his destination. The ribboned girl, hands lightly around the cool bracket of the unlit lantern, understood the same rule with a watcher's instinct. Some arrivals ask for witnesses, not escorts. Snow continued its rehearsal on pump and rail. The blacksmith, hearing nothing that sounded like trouble, eased his doors nearly shut and leaned his elbows on the sill to listen better. The schoolmaster, who had been considering the distance between law and law until the kettle insisted on tea, brought his cup to the window and watched the level tilt of the man's hat cross the dusk, pleased by the geometry of an errand that was purposeful yet unhurried. Miss Calder's door stood open in its new untheatrical posture, and the cat, having finished the evening's arithmetic, hedge minus wind plus the chance of a moth, sat like an alderman at the threshold. The letter under the piano lid made no light, of course, but the rooms held a faint radiance, as they do when a long absence has been spoken to and taught its manners. At the parsonage, the minister's wife lit the small plate, said a name softly enough not to startle it, and glanced across the green. She saw the figure touch 2 fingers to his brim, a greeting to the general company of doors, and then turn, guided by some private compass, not to Miss Calder's, but to the schoolhouse steps, where 1,000 recitations and a few sleeve-wiped tears had been spent behind the water pail. The schoolmaster, surprised and amused, went down to meet him with the key already in his hand, as if a page were ready to be turned and wanted a reader. Inside, the wide room received them with varnish, chalk, and the faint perfume of old apples. The visitor removed his hat and waited, while his coat let go its borrowed snow in tiny, soundless avalanches. In his hand he held a modest parcel tied with string, the sort of exactly made bundle a careful post clerk takes pride in. Small precision guarding something worth more than its size. When he spoke, his voice had the good grain of someone who has offered good evening more often than he has been greeted with it. He explained in sentences that respected the air between them that he had waited the proper days for a town to hush, preferring to carry certain bundles when bells were not arguing with anyone. He had been away, no need for names. Names would tangle the simplicity. And now, returning by a road that asked no loudness of him, he had brought what the far office had kept until a claim was ready. A neat stack of small copybooks from years ago, bearing a name in the flyleaf that matched the school's own hand. A folded plan for oiling hinges, cleanly drawn with pins and plates. And, wrapped within every other wrapping, a brass handbell with a hairline crack, once sent off by a certain teacher to be mended, and then, when grief rearranged the desks of life, forgotten. The schoolmaster set his fingers to the bell's cold rim and found his mouth shape an O, not for wonder, but for rightness. The syllable a person makes when a missing piece fits back without fanfare. He lifted the little instrument and felt at once the hitch in its voice. The crack would not be argued with, but when he rang it gently, the sound, though divided, carried with new courtesy, 2 tones sharing one duty. He laughed, a laugh akin to last night's chalked apology, rinsed away. Something once whole, now altered, kinder for its seam. They sorted the copybooks, while Dusk leaned an elbow on the sill. 2 held secret passengers, trailed comets, convincing horses, a house labelled Our House, Autumn, and the schoolmaster, stern with himself against sentiment, allowed a small current of remembrance to take him a few steps. The visitor, his errand complete, accepted a cup as naturally as if the room had been expecting him, and said, without wanting praise, that the far office is a threshold too. Things go there to learn patience and come home when both sides can receive them. When they stepped out again, the lane had lit its lamps and the village had settled into that evening key where every noise sounds tuned to a softer pitch. The visitor touched his brim once more, this time to the company of people rather than doors, and took the bend toward the river path, the bell rapped against new bruises. The schoolmaster watched until the figure closed into the dark like a sentence ending with a period that promises another paragraph. At the foot of the steps he met the printer's boy, who, with the care the night had taught, did not ask. He merely looked at the edges of what the master carried and let the man choose. The bell, revealed like a coin in a child's palm, rang its divided note, ring and echo nested together, and the boy smiled because it sounded like the hour itself, old and new, law and law, a joined difference. Across the lane, the ribboned girl lifted the unlit lantern to her cheek, as if greeting an old friend. Miss Calder, in her doorway, saw the two men with their small shared weight and inclined her head, acknowledging the grammar of a town that knows how to return to itself. Snow thickened from rehearsal to decision, still light, a white dust with manners, and the blacksmith, reading weather by the pitch of flakes on tin, set a bucket under the eave so melt would have a place to think. The minister's wife trimmed the wick so the plate's flame would hold steady through any draught, and in that restrained pool of light the peaches remembered summer without asking to be it. The cat, mathematician of thresholds, traced a narrow figure 8 across the sill, sealing the evening's proof with an elegance only cats employ. The schoolmaster hung the bell by the door, not as an alarm, but as a heartbeat. And when he stepped back, its small cord seemed to braid itself into the softened town sounds. Iron settling, a shovel leaned to rest, a fiddle trying one low note, and then thinking better. And because evenings like this repeat their thesis in fainter ink, the ribboned girl found the matchbox and did not strike. She set it beside the lantern on the window ledge, posture without insistence, while the printer's boy, passing, tapped the press stone twice, call, response, and moved on. Miss Calder lifted the piano lid 2 inches and let it fall softly, a bow, and far down by the bend, where the river's skin keeps its counsel, a fox wrote cursive in the first true snow and did not wait for anyone to read. The bell, home now, flawed and perfect at it, kept its peace. The town, having learned another small chord in its long, slow song, breathed, and at the field's edge the sky shifted a shade deeper blue, as if an unseen hand were turning a page toward the next. Very quiet line that would bring a footprint to a stoop, a letter to a table, or a lantern, at last, to a patient flame. Night drew its second breath, and the snow, having made up its mind with modesty, went to work in silence, flakes like stitched linen drifting between lamp and hedge, softening the dusk-laid prints until the lane wore a fresh, forgiving skin. The printer's boy locked the press with a last affectionate pat, the iron receiving it like a patient animal accepting a blanket. Stepping out, he caught the schoolhouse bell at the corner of his sight. Newly home, hairline cracked, its small dark oval resting on the clapboard like punctuation that calms a line. He thought of all the mornings a bell had begun with brisk command, and how different this one felt already, less order than invitation, and he crossed the green at a pace the night approved. The ribboned girl, having helped her grandmother fold the day away, wood stacked square, matches gathered, a cup inverted on its saucer so dust would find no seat, slipped on her shawl and stepped into the snow with the instinct of one listening for something that may not be sound. She paused by the window where lantern and matchbox waited, as posture, not plan, then carried the unlit square to the stoop, as one carries a letter whose address is not yet certain. Across the lane, Miss Calder left her door ajar by a measured hand's breadth, letting the house show its temper without shiver, and the cat, expert in winter arithmetic, blinked at the weather, weighed the merits of threshold and mat, and chose the seam that touched both. The minister's wife, having trimmed the plate's flame as one trims a sentence to its essence, took a careful turn along the walk and murmured, not in petition, but in thanks. The names the night had returned nearer. The blacksmith tapped his hammer once on the anvil, and once again, an old bench code that says, I am here, and so am I. While out by the bend, the fox's faint cursive kept writing its unreadable evening letter. From the schoolhouse a small company began to gather, without being called. The town's old trick of arriving together for what belongs to no one alone. First the schoolmaster, with a lantern half covered by his palm, so its light would not grow proud. Then the printer's boy, hat brushed free of new snow. Then the two boys, of licorice and chalk, repute, each carrying a broom like an honest pen. A pair of older women with the brisk purpose of companions who have shared births and burials. The minister's wife and the blacksmith, an odd duet that felt as right as rope and iron. And from her doorway, Miss Calder, not hurrying, drawing her shawl close, and resting a hand a moment on the piano lid, as if promising the instrument she would return. No speeches formed, and yet something like a rehearsal moved among them. The schoolmaster lifted the cracked bell, and before the sound glanced up the lane as one looks along a road before stepping. When he rang it, the note came, two voices sharing one skin, the crack confessing itself and making the tone more human. It carried cleanly, not far, but far enough to stitch the porches together. The ribboned girl felt it arrive against the ribs where her Wingift sentence lived, and knew she had been listening for this. Not a declaration nor news, but a small, durable beginning. The boys, in their better sort of mischief, brushed snow from the school steps, and then from every neighbour's stoop within reach, without trespass. The printer's boy, half embarrassed, fished out the shy comma and the orphaned ampersand and set them on the schoolmaster's palm. The master received them with the gravity of a teacher accepting 2 seeds for the classroom garden. Once and again, the boy said, no need to explain the grammar. The town had learned a measure it could keep each year, not like law, but like a lullaby one hums, while other work continues. When the bell's twin voice settled, Miss Calder stepped forward with an envelope, its mended edge neat as a healed seam, and placed it in the schoolmaster's hands to keep with the copybooks until she chose its next harbour. No one asked to hear the letter, yet everyone felt the rightness of papers living, for a while, where learning is kept. The minister's wife, as if answering an unspoken wish, slipped a sugared square of preserved peel to each chalk-stained boy, penance paid, sweetness learned, while the blacksmith, fond of talismans he could pass off as practical, pressed one of his 3 nails into the printer's boy's hand and said, for your door, leaving unsaid what all 3 understood. Good hinges deserve remembering, snow thickened by patient degrees, drawing a gentler underline beneath the cemetery fence. The ribboned girl, the lantern still unlit in her hands, looked toward the gate and then toward the schoolhouse and chose, as a seamstress chooses thread, by feel. She asked softly if the lantern might sit beside the bell for a time, and the schoolmaster's yes came as an old form newly met, They hung the square by the door, unlit, a posture of readiness, while the bell's shadow rounded into a companion shape, like two shoulders in an easy conversation. People dispersed the way snow falls, quietly, a pattern legible only from a distance. The boys took their brooms, home like violins. The elder women compared recipes in undertones that made the cold feel fed. The minister walked with his wife, speaking of firewood promised to a widow whose pile had dwindled more than it should. The blacksmith touched each latch he passed without seeming to, a physician taking pulses. Miss Calder, bearing a small gingham parcel fragrant for the ribboned girl's grandmother, stepped back through her door and left it as she had learned, kissed to, but not shut. The schoolmaster lingered a minute longer, hand on the bell's strap, thinking, without hurry, that arguments would come as they must, about origins and propriety, and how much paper costumes could claim of what once belonged to smoke and song, but he would start any such talk by ringing this gentle thing, acknowledging its seam, and letting the divided tone argue better than he could for a practice that had found its manners. At last he turned for home. The printer's boy walked beside him as far as the green, and they parted with the small, satisfied quiet of craftsmen whose tools have agreed. He looked back once at the schoolhouse door, where lantern and bell kept a friendly watch, one dark for now, one quiet for now, like twin sentences waiting for breath. Snow wrote a clean grammar across the lane. The fox's cursive filled and softened. Along the hill the rails hid their silver and kept their line in white. The ribboned girl reached her stoop and set the lantern on the window ledge beside the matchbox that had learned patience. Inside the glass, a faint soot rune held its night memory. Her grandmother, warming her hands at the stove's blue whisper, listened to the bell's remnant in the air and said, without turning, "Well then," as if a chapter had named itself. Far off, the river worked beneath its skin, steady as breath. Nearer by, the cat traced a final figure 8 and chose at last the inside of the line. Above the hedge, the sky took on that particular grain that means more snow will come, and with it perhaps a traveller, or a question, or a settling, something small that knows the way, headed toward a door that has spent the day learning to open without hurry. Snow settled into a measured hush, smoothing roofs and fields, and even the raised edges of the day's small excitements, until the lane lay calm and carefully folded. In that whitened quiet, the schoolhouse bell and the unlit lantern kept their companion vigil, one flawed and home, the other dark and patient, like old friends content to share air without filling it. The ribboned girl, returning from the far end of the green, where she'd carried stew to a widow and brought back a bowl warm with thanks, followed the path she and the snow had agreed upon together, her steps light, the flakes polite, and found the town altered again in the tender way change prefers. Thresholds had learned a new posture and were practicing it without display. At the parsonage window, a modest flame had yielded to a saucer of crumbs and a skin of milk because a sparrow insisted on being real. The minister's wife let her hands rest and watched the candle's absence become a different tenderness, as if the room had chosen to remember by feeding. Across the lane, the blacksmith tried a latch he'd oiled at dusk, and heard it consent to open with almost no voice at all, the music of craft refined to a whisper, thinking of the nail he'd slipped to the printer's boy and the quiet courage it takes for a hinge to keep welcoming in weather. The printer's boy himself, sleeves dusted from early deliveries, stepped out to listen for the bell's divided note. He did not ring it, no ceremony needed, but stood close enough to feel its presence as one hears a river without seeing it, then took from his pocket the shy comma and the orphaned ampersand, balanced them on his palm and tucked them back like a promise, checked without disturbing it. In Miss Calder's house, where the piano lid wore a faint snow glow and the mended envelope rested among the copybooks, she brewed a little tea and left the latch riding that easy place between closed and open. She expected no footsteps, and yet she made room for them, a different kind of expectation. The cat endorsed the grammar with a blink and a practised curl of tail. The schoolmaster, tidying desks after the children's mitten-bright scuffle of dismissal, paused beside the bell and felt the town's newly learned chords settle into muscle, threshold, hospitality, remembrance. Chalk on his cuffs, he wrote himself, a keeper for leaner nights. We ring what has a crack, and it teaches us to listen kinder. He wondered fondly how supper debates would fare, Gaelic bone under an American coat, a church-tamed fire living indoors, then smiled, remembering how the children had swept the steps at noon and set the lantern by the bell without asking which book allowed it. Passing the schoolhouse, the ribboned girl traced a tiny circle on the lantern's frosted pane, a thumbnail moon clearing to the unlit wick, and let the promise remain unstruck, the way an empty chair makes a room kinder simply by waiting. Down by the bend, the fox returned and added a footnote to the snow's clean page. Near the tracks, the rails lay white and modest, withholding their shine, but not their line. And the river, working under its pale skin, spoke the syllable a listener hears only when their own breathing has slowed to meet it. Yes. In kitchens, lids rose and settled with the tact families adopt when small miracles have recently crossed a room. The minister, back from carrying wood and a soft story, tipped his hat toward the schoolhouse as though greeting a parishioner. The bell replied by keeping still, which felt exactly right. And the blacksmith, who distrusted metaphors, but lived among them anyway, heard the hinge of evening move cleanly, as if the snow itself were oil. A traveller did appear at last, a woman with a carpet bag and a coat, lucid with flake light, coming from the station with the practised humility of someone who keeps her feet when the world slants. She looked first to the parsonage and received the smallest nod of being seen, then to Miss Calder's, whose door wore a new gentleness, like a knit collar, then to the schoolhouse, where bell and lantern stood in their silent duet, and finally to the blue-shuttered house where by good accidents a room had been mended and a quilt turned right side out. There the ribboned girl's grandmother, long versed in reading arrivals like weather, opened before any knock could be awkward and spoke the line that belongs to towns at their best. You look like you've come far. Come in and warm your hands. No story heavy enough to trouble the night was traded, only the light cargo that travels first. A name, a town behind, the next ahead, boots set by the stove with grateful squeaks. A cup, the slow astonishment of fingers remembering heat. Crossing with a parcel for the schoolmaster, copy paper, and a new ribbon for the maps, the printer's boy saw the threshold accept its guest and felt beneath his ribs the same clean click as type falling true. He raised a hand in greeting without intruding and moved on, resolving to tuck somewhere in tomorrow's least notice column a single line of thanks about paths kept open through snow and doors that know their work. Miss Calder, cup in hand at her own threshold, watched this choreography with a calm like receiving good marks on an exam life had neglected to announce. The cat, satisfied with the evening's administration, blinked once and drew a deeper breath. Night took another quiet inch, through hedges, over stoops, into careful shutter seams. The bell stirred once in the draught and settled, and the lantern, wearing the fingertip moon the girl had traced, held its darkness like a promise wrapped for later. Tomorrow scholars would resume their kindly dispute. Children would draw brooms over the steps unbidden. The blacksmith would touch latches like a discreet guardian, and the minister's wife would trade the saucer of milk for a slice of toast because someone would be hungry and real. Along the fence, a single track, too neat for fox, too small for dog, would begin at the bend and come with impeccable courtesy to a stop just shy of a door that had been practicing all day how to open without hurry, as if something thoughtful had reached the threshold and paused, listening, the way a letter leans at a table's edge before choosing which hand will lift it. By morning, the snow had written soft errata across the lane, footprints edited into clean margins, wheel ruts gentled into quiet lines, and with the day's clarity came daylight's tidy habit to sort, to name, to correct. Over shop counters and at the pump, a few kindly misconceptions flooded through like well-meaning sparrows, and the town, without sharpness, answered them the new way it had learned, by pointing to what had happened rather than insisting on what ought to be. "It's only mischief," someone said, stacking tins with a moralist's neat care. Yet the tins themselves shone in a window that had hosted a plate, and the Cooper's gate, once spirited off and now set straighter, replied with its hinge. Not only. Mischief had learned to apologise and kept the lesson folded in its pocket like a handkerchief to be used again. "It's only pagan," another voice offered, nudging a troublesome word back across the counter. But the parsonage, where a candle had yielded to crumbs and milk when a sparrow asked to be real, made the better argument without saying it. Courtesy has many dialects, and bread prayed over in Latin or Scots, or simple kitchen English, answers hunger the same. "It's only American," a traveller smiled, fond of newness, yet the blacksmith's county Antrim turnip face lived companionably beside pumpkins, round as moons. The old bonfire had crouched into stoves and learned to warm rooms without vaulting the fence. And on the schoolhouse wall a cracked bell from another year rang more tenderly than a perfect one, proof that lineage and transformation share a bench. The schoolmaster, who believed debates deserved air but not dominion, listened and merely lifted his chin toward the copybooks waiting by the bell. Customs keep their proofs on ordinary paper, chalk rinsed, chairs righted, letters finally arrived. A lantern hung unlit like a seat kept for the late. In the general store, the printer's boy set a small line where few eyes begin. Gates borrowed for merriment had mostly come home by themselves, and those that hadn't were escorted back with liquorish apologies. He added nothing grand, no treatise on Samhain folded into All Hallows, no thesis of mummers ripening into masks, and yet the type seemed to breathe easier, as if metal enjoyed telling truths that fit within a single morning's patience. Over her tea, Miss Calder made another daylight mistake by being simple. "It's only grief," someone sighed at her threshold, gently, as if grief were a tired dog, and she nodded, lifted the piano lid, and sounded one thin chord that held no bitterness. "Grief," the note suggested, "is a room made truer when the door learns not to slam." The cat, clerkly as ever, endorsed the remark by laying a paw on the threshold as if to stamp the ledger. At the parsonage, a neighbour cautioned, "Mind you, we don't encourage superstition." The minister's wife smiled, the way one smiles when a curtain tries to govern a window the wind has already claimed. "Superstition bargains," she said in the evenness of her tasks, "remembrance, practices manners." Then she traded saucer for toast, because the woman with the carpet bag had gone on with her errand and left behind a hunger that was not theoretical. Down at the livery, the blacksmith corrected the belief that a festival is a flare and then nothing by showing the colder virtue. Hinges oiled after, latches tested, the quiet music of a town confirming that doors opened last night still know how to open today. He kept the last of his 3 nails in his pocket without sermon, talisman only, in that it taught his hand to touch a latch kindly, and when the printer's boy passed, the two exchanged the tap and nod that says, in a language older than arguments, I recall, and so do I. The ribboned girl, sweeping the stoop with her now reflexive courtesy, the broom lifted a heartbeat above the step between passes so as not to scold the wood, answered the mildest misconception of all, the one that prefers spectacle to patience. It's only one night. She shook her head, not to contradict, but to widen the frame. One night is a key, she thought. The lock it turns is daily. All day she watched the tumblers settle, a widow's wood stacked by neighbours who had cheerfully disputed etymologies. A child who, having worn a mask to learn another face, now greeted the shy boy next door without needing it. A bell whose divided tone had taught a room to listen both backward and forward and braid the strands into one rope. By afternoon the snow had softened to lace at every hem, and talk, having warmed its hands at its own cleverness, grew practical again, a fence to mend where the fox had signed in neat cursive. Sanding wanted on the schoolhouse step. At 9 tomorrow the train would carry letters outward and home. In his attendance book the schoolmaster wrote 3 small words where only he would see them: threshold, hospitality, remembrance, and added a 4th, practice. He shut the cover with the contentment of someone choosing a sensible glove for a long winter. Blue light pooled in the shutter's panes. Inside the grandmother folded a quilt and laid it on the mended bed where the traveller had slept by grace of a town that understood doors. The traveller had risen before dawn, left a small thanks and a faint citrus behind, and walked out without needing to become a tale. Miss Calder carried the letter to the schoolhouse, and at the schoolmaster's gentle insistence, placed it among the copybooks for safekeeping until she wanted it back on her table. The cracked bell glanced a small shadow onto the envelope, like a promise that what is sounded will be heard. The printer's boy, who knows where to place a line to be found by those who need it, and passed by those who don't, slipped a notice beside berths and ships. Neighbours who keep a lamp or a plate by the window are thanked for steadying the weather. He touched the comma in his pocket and let it be. Some breaths belong between words. Toward evening, the arguments gentled into anecdotes and then into pie receipts. Smoke went up straight. Doors breathed as people came and went on errands eased by hinges trained last night, and just as the sky put on its agreed-upon blue, the schoolhouse bell spoke once. No summons, merely a clearing of the throat, its twin notes knitting through the lane like a stitch picked up after a rest. Passing with kindling, the ribboned girl paused at the lantern and laid her glove to its glass. Inside, the wick kept its dark like a seed. The circle she'd traced in last night's frost had gone to water and then to air. But the opening remained. Not all lights need lighting to do their work. Beyond the last garden, where the fields begin again to think of frost, a pale track, too neat for fox, too tidy for dog, drew itself carefully toward a stoop and stopped just shy of the mat, as if something mindful had arrived to listen before knocking, while in the parsonage a single crumb on a saucer waited, unembarrassed, for whatever name the evening would choose for mercy this time. Evening drew on its blue again, and the lane, remembering, slid into that key without a cue. Lamps rose a notch, doors learned once more to close without comment, and the snow made its patient choices of fence and stoop. In that tempered light, the town's small story, kept carefully close, imagined, how it might walk past its own hedges, not by clamour, but along the quiet paths stories prefer. In the general store's window, a travelling man set his magic lantern and sent a pageant of glass across a hanging sheet. Harvests, comets, a far bridge, then, with a flourish, so modest it nearly apologised, showed children in paper masks and a pumpkin whose smile resembled a grandmother's patience. Shoulders in the doorway softened, as they do when something familiar comes home in a new coat. The printer's boy, who knew how ink becomes weather, thought how these images, lantern slides tonight, stereographs tomorrow, would step from house to house like practiced guests, teaching distant rooms the grammar of a door left gentle. He imagined, without yet having the names, a time when moving pictures would carry such evenings like seedlings wrapped in paper, and later still, a radio voice would speak the season's name, and 10,000 rooms would answer with the same courteous nod. At her threshold, Miss Calder warmed her hands on a cup and remembered parlour entertainments where a borrowed bell and a shawl over a chair could make a play. She glanced at the cracked bell across the green and thought, without melancholy, how every object that agrees to speak in a village becomes a kind of actor. Pumpkins learning faces, plates learning patience, even a letter learning to arrive on the very breath the night has prepared for it. The schoolmaster, keeper of penny ballads and broadsides beneath his bed, turned over the plain clothes ways. Stories travel. A verse hummed while sweeping, a small woodcut of a lantern reprinted in a farmer's almanac, a city column calling certain rural nights antique frolic, a phrase he disliked and cherished in equal measure for the tenderness it smuggled into type. Across the lane, the blacksmith regarded, kindly, the store's lithograph, where a rude, knotty turnip face kept company with a round, generous pumpkin. County Antrim rose in his mind, and he decided with a craftsman's calm that traditions are metal, worked at different heats. Same ore, new temper, still good in the hand. Near the stove, the traveller with the carpet bag, now neighbour by courtesy, sat with the ribboned girl's grandmother and spoke shyly, then easier, of her northern town where paper lanterns are strung along a cord and a nonsense rhyme thanks the doors. The grandmother smiled at the way songs migrate like geese, familiar in outline, different in voice, and offered a verse that fit the rhyme without crowding it. Walking back from the lantern show, the printer's boy pictured a slim column in some future sheet, an old-time Hallowe'en, with a wood engraving of a pumpkin in a window and a caption that remembered badly but loved well. He would forgive the errors if the posture were right and the door refused to slam. Down by the schoolhouse, the bell sat easy, while the unlit lantern kept its square dark promise by the jamb. The chalk scrubbers came, and unable to resist, posed as men of solemn importance for an imagined photograph, one pointing at the bell cord, one steadying the lantern bracket for posterity. The wind rearranged their hats, laughter broke the tableau. That too was a record worth keeping, if not in albums, then in the way a town adjusts its smile when it speaks of itself. The minister's wife's saucer put away and ear kept for any soft knock that sounded like hunger, thought of picture Bibles teaching oceans of strangers to see the same parables. She felt, without the word, that a century would come to teach with light instead of woodcut, and she hoped that when a scene of children at a lantern door flickered in 10,000 parlours, the audience would read the invisible script behind it, the plate by the window, the apology chalked and rinsed, the bell rung with its honest crack. As the night leaned closer, a procession of possible futures slipped over the town's face, like clouds skimming a low moon. A city theatre where a trickster wears a pumpkin head, a dime novel that turns courtesy into courage and sells out by morning, a later autumn when costumed children trade verses for rap sweets and a phrase, trick or treat, does the old work of soul cakes and rhymes. Each image wore, beneath its novelty, the pattern this lane knew, by hand, door, threshold, kindness, return. And the schoolmaster, warming his palm on the bell, took comfort that even a story that forgets its footnotes may remember its manners. Snow sifted finer across the rails. The fox left punctuation nobody could read and everybody admired. Miss Calder set down her cup and, on a feeling, opened her door the taut hand's breadth. The cat, pleased by consistency, chose the exact middle of the threshold for its rest. Above the hedge, a patient star stepped forward like a lantern slide, bringing itself into focus, as if the world, preparing a closing page, meant this night's face to reappear, once and again, wherever stories go, to teach the dark how to sit nearer to the light. The second night settled like a palm smoothing a quilt, and the town, having tried its many names for the same tenderness, let quiet do the last of the work. The schoolhouse bell dozed, unashamed. In its crack, the lantern kept its dark as a seed keeps spring. The snow leaded the fence rails in a gentle script no one hurried to read. In the blue-shuttered house, the ribboned girl stood by the window with the matchbox at rest in her palm. She did not strike it. With a fingertip she drew the smallest of doors on the glass and watched it open and vanish. A lesson bone deep now. Lights need not always burn to teach lightness. Thresholds need not always be crossed to practice welcome. Her grandmother, tying the day's last bow in the cupboard string, said some years will be kinder for having remembered this one. And the girl, feeling the bell's divided tone still under her ribs, answered that the hinge in the air had learned its swing. Across the lane Miss Calder set the letter on her table without bracing for its weight. She poured a cup for herself, and almost without thinking placed an empty cup beside it. Not waste, but permission. 3 notes under her hand, and the house replied as a friend does when no explanation is required. Explanation is. The printer's boy laid the shy comma and the orphaned ampersand on the press stone and looked at the small breath they held and pocketed them again, resolved to keep their grammar in his fingers whenever the world tried to force a headline sharp. He touched the nail the blacksmith had given him to his own latch and felt, faintly, how the hinge remembered. The schoolmaster, straightening chairs with custom's new patience, tucked the copybooks and the letter into the bell's shadow and wrote one final sentence on a scrap that would never see print. Keep a door gentle and the year will turn itself. He folded it into the attendance book, the way one keeps an absent child's name. The minister and his wife, plate washed, saucer dried, took a slow turn beneath the hedges and named, not doctrine, but the small graces they had seen. A gate returned truer than before. Licorice ribbon curled like apology that meant it. Iron learning to open softly. A cat conducting a town without raising a paw. A letter choosing the right hour. A bell discovering the reason for its crack. Hearing their steps, the blacksmith answered with 2 taps, enough and amen, then banked his fire to a cold blue whisper and left a last nail on the sill for morning light to bless. Snow, merciful in its ordinariness, fell as if it meant to forgive roofs and mistakes alike. The fox wrote a final line and withdrew. The rails held their course for tomorrow's 9 and boasted nothing of it. House by house, the day completed itself. The broom leaned with its bristles tucked. The matchbox learned patience by heart. The plate found its place, whether full or waiting. The door discovered the exact ease between shut and open, and the people, without speeches, without medals, felt themselves part of a chord the town could hum whenever cold or worry shortened breath. If the world beyond these fields chooses, in years ahead, to dress this night in brighter lanterns or grander costumes, if printed sheets, magic lanterns, and later wonders set it on their stages in newer keys, may the old posture stay beneath the silk like a steady hand. Leave a seat open. Keep a flame for company, not conquest. Ring what is cracked so its tone reminds you to listen kindly. Let mischief practice apology until it no longer needs the mask. Feed whatever knocks and looks like hunger. And because stories like to leave a little snow where they pass, the lane arranged a last grace. The schoolhouse door breathed its soft welcome to no one in particular. The lantern by its jamb, unlit, wore the thumbprint the girl had left, and seemed content to be promise rather than event. The bell leaned into the draught and kept its silence, as if to say silence teaches too. Miss Calder's cat traced one dignified figure, ate and folded evening into night, and somewhere between the parsonage and the gate, a sparrow, full of crumbs and unafraid, tucked its head and agreed to morning. Thank you for walking here and listening, and letting the dark sit near your light without worry. May your own door find its gentle place on the latch, and may your sleep take the easy road with a lantern exactly where you need it, and a bell, cracked and perfect, ready to sound only when kindness asks.